Hello, I'm Dr. Salus. Last time, we discussed 6 strategies to employ when LDL cholesterol levels are elevated. Please watch it if you haven't already. Let's start with the American Heart Association's treatment guidelines for dyslipidemia, also known as hypercholesterolemia. According to the guidelines, medication is essential even in healthy adults without cardiovascular disease if LDL is greater than 190, and they advise using the medication aggressively. Moreover, if you have diabetes, they advise you to take medicine even if your LDL is higher than 70. Let's take a look at the standards for high-risk populations, specifically those who have already experienced a myocardial infarction. LDL is said to be reduced to less than 70 in the United States. Europe takes another step forward. The European Society of Cardiology suggests decreasing it to less than 55. To exaggerate a little, in order to fulfill this requirement, you must consume statins as if they were a meal. If you use statins, your LDL level will decrease, and the lower it decreases, the healthier you will be. So, what are the main kind of videos you are watching? It's the doctrine of the mean. Do you know what the first thing to do is? Look at both extremes first. When you think about cardiovascular disease, you probably think of 3 numbers: blood pressure, blood sugar, and cholesterol. Blood pressure and sugar levels are straightforward. All you have to do is look at both ends of that number. When looking at the extremes of cholesterol levels, however, unlike blood pressure and diabetes, you should not only look at LDL. Consider a research conducted on 7,000 middle-aged men in Scotland 25 years ago. Because the individuals had no underlying cardiovascular disease, this was a primary prevention clinical trial. For 5 years, they compared the group taking 40 milligrams of pravastatin, a type of statin, to the control group. The average LDL level was 190 at the start, and those who reduced it by 24% reduced their risk of coronary artery disease by 45%. The researchers went even further, lowering LDL by 40%. LDL was reduced to 110. Well, then, of course, there will be a decrease in cardiovascular disease. That's what they predicted. But it wasn't the case. The benefit of reducing coronary artery disease was the same between those who lowered their LDL from 190 to 150 and even lowered it to 110. It's like they went further in search of more gold but came up empty handed. The author's conclusions were as follows. This is crucial. LDL reduction alone does not fully explain the benefits of statin therapy. Let us now offer additional blood tests to determine the exact extremes of high LDL. Lipoprotein A is the first test item. It's a separate cause of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. Apolipoprotein B envelops LDL particles and is linked to apolipoprotein A. Lipoprotein A is highly heritable, and the typical range is less than 30. Familial hypercholesterolemia is a genetic disorder that affects 1 out of every 500 people. If lipoprotein A is larger, this hereditary condition should be suspected. Also, if your LDL is higher than 180 or you have a history of cardiovascular disease before the age of 60, get this figure. The risk of cardiovascular disease doubles if your lipoprotein A is over 30. I mentioned before that the LDL target for high risk people with cardiovascular disease is 70 or less, right? To do this, the Colorado School of Medicine study team gave a potent medicine known as a PCSK9 inhibitor to 20,000 cardiovascular patients from 57 nations. Over a 3-year period, however, a decrease in cardiovascular disease did not occur when LDL was reduced to 70, but only when lipoprotein A level were reduced to less than 14. Lipoprotein A is not only an indication of cholesterol metabolism, but also of the degree of chronic inflammation. Remember, it's inflammation. The second item is small dense LDL. The abbreviation is SDLDL. This chemical has the ability to enter deep into blood arteries and cause arteriosclerosis. Let's have a look at the following study to determine how likely it is to induce coronary artery disease. In Denmark, 40,000 people were surveyed over 3 years, and the higher the number, the worse the situation. This is due to the fact that the primary mechanism by which SDLDL destroys vascular endothelium is linked to increased chronic inflammation. I mentioned before that eating plenty of unsaturated fatty acids and fiber can help decrease LDL. Make careful to watch the last video. In clinical trials, almonds, dark chocolate, avocado, and pistachio lowered SDLDL even without statins. Another thing to keep in mind is that regular exercise lowers SDLDL. Surprisingly, exercise has little effect on LDL. Doctors, on the other hand, do not say, oh, don't exercise because it cannot lower LDL. Exercise is critical for cardiovascular health and longevity. So, you should not only consider the LDL levels. Before looking at the third item, let's have a look at how cholesterol is classified based on density. LDL does not, as you can see, include other low density substances that induce atherosclerosis, such as lipoprotein A, IDL, intermediate density lipoprotein, and VLDL, very low density lipoprotein. The third classification is residual cholesterol, which includes low density compounds. Many people with high LDL develop cardiovascular disease despite taking medication. This is referred to as residual risk. This is mainly due to cholesterol in triglycerides or triglyceride-rich lipoproteins. Residual cholesterol is an excellent predictor of this. This is not a new blood test, but it does necessitate some math. Simply subtract total cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, and LDL cholesterol. A study looked at the incidence of cardiovascular disease over 5 years based on the type of cholesterol in Spanish older adults who had three or more cardiovascular risk factors. Again, LDL was not the true culprit.
Oh,
In comparison to cases where both LDL and residual levels were low, those with LDL levels below 100 and residual levels above 30 had a 2.7-fold increased risk of cardiovascular disease. When LDL was greater than 100 and the residual value was low, less than 30, there was no increase in cardiovascular disease risk. Even when both LDL and residual were raised, the risk was 1.9 times lower than when only the residual value was elevated.
oh,
Isn't it surprising? In addition to direct arteriosclerosis, elevated residual cholesterol causes inflammation in the cardiovascular system. Inflammation also appears here. Consider a survey of 20,000 Americans that yielded similar results. For 18 years, people with an average age of 52 were examined. The difference between this study and the prior Spanish study is that they had fewer cardiovascular risk factors and were younger. The threshold point for high residual cholesterol in this study was 24, and those who exceeded this cutoff were 1.6 times more likely to develop cardiovascular disease. When you are young, the requirements for moderation are predictably higher. We mentioned previously that the threshold for high residual cholesterol of the elderly population in Spain was 30, right? Take a look at this. Even if your LDL is greater than 130, if your residual cholesterol is less than 24, there is no increased cardiovascular risk. Furthermore, even if LDL was low, residual cholesterol was a significantly more trustworthy indication than LDL. The findings are consistent with the findings of the Spanish study. As a result, the residual cholesterol level should be less than 30 for persons over 60 and less than 24 for people under 60. Now, here's one unbelievable fact. Isn't it true that all heart societies agree on the need of lowering LDL? In the American study we just mentioned, however, persons with LDL lower than 70 had an increased risk of cardiovascular disease when their residual cholesterol levels were high. It's nearly four times that. It's like being kicked in the foot by the low LDL you believed in. Fourth, there is an item termed non-HDL cholesterol, which is made up entirely of bad cholesterol. This is accomplished by subtracting HDL from total cholesterol. Isn't it simple to calculate? LDL is also included. If you do not have cardiovascular disease, the benchmark is less than 130. Non-HDL or residual cholesterol levels are a good sign of cardiovascular disease or a shortened lifespan if you have diabetes, obesity, metabolic syndrome, or increased triglycerides. If any of the above apply to you, please check these two items. A study of 13,000 Danes undergoing statin medication over 8 years validated the above facts. What exactly was it? According to researchers, targeting LDL alone carries a high risk of overlooking other atherosclerotic lipoproteins. A LDL level greater than 89 had no effect on the risk of death or myocardial infarction in this investigation. What were the European standards for LDL? Isn't it under 55? Instead, the issue was that the non-HDL level was above 120 and the apolipoprotein B level was above 92. LDL is not to blame. Here comes the fifth item, apolipoprotein B. This figure might be useful as well. C-reactive protein, or CRP for short, is the sixth item. Cholesterol is linked to inflammation, although not everyone with high cholesterol has high inflammation levels. It is like excellent things are expensive, but not all expensive things are excellent. CRP levels below 2 were not associated with the risk of cardiovascular disease or all-cause mortality in a 13-year trial of 5,000 Americans, regardless of lipoprotein A level. Furthermore, even when CRP was elevated, there was no influence on cardiovascular health when lipoprotein A levels were low. However, as the CRP went above 2, inflammation increased. In this case, as lipoprotein A levels increased, lifespan was reduced. In addition to lowering cholesterol, statins can also reduce inflammation. For example, in cases where the CRP increased above 2, even though the LDL level was low below 130, primary prevention of cardiovascular disease was much better achieved when taking statins. Conversely, if the level of inflammation is normal, even if LDL is high, statins may not be effective. There are numerous well-known clinical trials on LDL. Of these, only one showed the benefit in extending lifespan by using statins for primary prevention in people without underlying cardiovascular disease. This was a clinical trial conducted on only those people with widespread inflammation in their bodies with a CRP higher than 2. Like this, in addition to cholesterol tests, inflammation levels may also need to be evaluated. These various figures are taken into account when determining where the extremes of LDL are. Perhaps we are miscalculating the range of extremes required to find moderation in cholesterol levels. Rather than treating everyone with high LDL, we need to better identify individuals who are truly at the extremes. I believe that focusing solely on LDL to prevent cardiovascular disease is likely like to viewing only the top of the iceberg. Food and exercise are two examples. There is a video where I discuss the importance of coffee moderation. Drinking 3 to 4 cups of coffee per day was linked to the lowest risk of cardiovascular mortality. However, according to a study of 360,000 British people that took their genes into consideration, the more coffee they drank, the higher their cholesterol levels. Coffee's lipid component, deuterpin, elevates cholesterol. This chemical, on the other hand, has anti-inflammatory qualities. As a result, the risk of cardiovascular disease can be reduced. Doesn't it make sense to avoid coffee if you need to lower your LDL to prevent cardiovascular disease? One egg per day raises LDL. Does this lead to an increase in cardiovascular disease? No. It is said to help reduce cardiovascular disease in Asians. Asians, albeit slightly. Fermented vinegar with no fructose. LDL cannot be reduced by it. However, this is a specialized medicine for cardiovascular health. How about exercise? It is unquestionably one of the ways to reduce your risk of heart disease. However, it has little effect on LDL. There are even studies that claim it has reason. Should we just sit around and not exercise because lowering LDL is better? Items other than LDL, which I mentioned earlier, are also strongly linked to inflammation, right? Exercise is a quick way to reduce chronic inflammation. The cholesterol guidelines of the societies I mentioned earlier, after seeing so many studies, I believe they are oversimplified. They are only interested in LDL, much like a meerkat. And the lower the better, I cannot concur. As previously stated, there are a variety of blood tests that provide better indicators of cardiovascular risk than low LDL. I believe that treating cholesterol with precision medicine that is tailored to each individual is necessary. I'm particularly interested in the precise prescription standards based on the 6 items mentioned above. Take medication if your LDL is this high. No, we must solve equation that account for a variety of other blood test items. Many people do not need statins, even if their LDL is high, because their other levels are normal. Aside from LDL levels, there are numerous other metrics to consider. I want you to understand this. Lipoprotein A, SDLDL, residual cholesterol, non-HDL cholesterol, apolipoprotein B, and CRP were the 6. Then the following time, we'll get to the crux of the cholesterol debate, the final straw, statins. Let's take a closer look at why current prescription standards deviate from the moderation doctrine of the mean when it's truly necessary. You can anticipate the next episode. Your subscriptions and likes will be extremely beneficial in the creation of more meaningful videos. Please activate the button. Salud.